This building would not be here without this man. He saved it from he saved those two hotels from demolition, and he's going to tell you the story in his own words.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it started 40 years ago, so I may have to check these notes to remember the names of people. In fact, I went to the Horton Grand site today, and I wanted to review some things to remember some things. And it was interesting because the story said, a person moved this hotel. Well, I'm that person. I was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Did my undergraduate work at Indiana University. There was a thing called the Vietnam War going on. And I signed up for the Navy. I became a naval officer, and they sent me to San Diego. Well, when I came to San Diego, Broadway, downtown was not a place you went. In those days, enlisted people they had to leave the ship in uniform. So then there were locker rooms all up and down Broadway where they would change into civilian clothes, and every imaginable thing was there to attract their attention. I was an enlisted guy. I was an officer, and so I went immediately to Mission Beach. So I never really knew anything about downtown. I didn't spend any time down here. I spent 4 years as a naval officer on an aircraft carrier over in North Island. Then I went to graduate school at San Diego State. I got out, being a fourth-generation entrepreneur. I decided to start my own business, doing a little real estate here and there. And I had a meeting downtown in 1978. And I made a wrong turn, and I went down 4th Avenue. And here were these old buildings. Well, when I grew up in Fort Wayne, I lived on the suburb about 5 miles out, and I would always ride the bus to town. Al's Bus was the name of it. Al drove it. And Al was a history buff, and he loved architecture, and downtown Fort Wayne looked like the Gaslamp Quarter. So from the age of 10, 11, 12, I was interested, and Al schooled me. So when I drove around and saw all these buildings, I thought, well, this is really interesting. And I ended up in front of the Grand Pacific Hotel. And it had been rehabbed. And then I noticed that most of them hadn't, because Mission Valley was the place now. I think in 1947, the most expensive real estate was Market and Fifth, but it wasn't that way in 1978. So then I drove down the street 2 or 3 times and walked around. It looked really interesting. And then I saw Tom Hom's sign, a real estate broker at the time. Well, I went home that night, and I'm standing in front of the Grand Pacific Hotel. I went home that night, and I turned on the television, and here was an interview by the local press person was interviewing the owner of the Grand Pacific Hotel. To which I said, got to be something here. So I called Tom Hom, and I went down to see Tom Hom, and we talked for a while in his office, and he said, I said, look, finance is my background. What's the finance around here? He said, well, they've redlined us here south of Broadway, so there really isn't any financing. I said, really? I said, I'm going to nose around. And so I went to see Bank of America. I opened the word south of Broadway, and they didn't want to talk to me anymore. So then Tom called me and he said, look, the Gaslamp Quarter Association has got a grant for 2 positions, one for an executive and the other for an assistant. And I said, I'm going to interview. And I went in and I said, look, you don't have any financing at all here. Why don't I'm applying for the number 2 job. I'm going to put finance officer on my card, and I'm going to go back and see these banks. I got the job. And I said, look, I'm going to do this for a year, and then I'm going to start my own development company. And so they said, fine. So it was fun, because I went to Bank of America. It was a memorable meeting. I walked in, and they had some junior guy, even younger than me, and I started to tell him, and he said, well, I said, isn't that redlining? Just a moment. Then I got to meet with the vice president. Well, then I went to Wells Fargo, and anyway, long and short of it is we arranged $10 million worth of financing for the Gaslamp Quarter. Well, at that time, the interest rates were like 10 or 12%. But there was a grant that the government had that you could get a second trust deed for 3%. So I began knocking on doors of people in the Gaslamp Quarter, and got various people who were starting to do their buildings. Which I wanted to do, got a few customers and clients started, and then I opened my own business, started to help them doing that. Well, that was 1979, and about August, I met a fellow named Jim Snyder, who was in the Keating building, and he said, I was talking to him, and he said, I'm about to meet with someone named Kit Goldman. And I said, oh yeah? And he said, yeah, and she's looking for space for a theater. She wants a theater. I said, oh really? Now, I had read in the 70s where Ernie Hahn was going to build a shopping center over here. And I had read that they'd torn down all this space and something about there were 2 buildings left there. Didn't mean anything to me, pay no attention. Well, when I got involved in the Gaslamp, I could see them. Here was this 30 blocks, and here's 2 buildings, an old hotel and a theater sitting right next to it. I looked at it, it made no sense to me. But I met Kit then, and Kit was producing or co-producing a show in the Lyceum Theater. Here was the Lyceum next to the Horton Grand Hotel. Well, I got interested in Kit Goldman, and then I got interested in the Horton Grand Hotel, and then I got interested in the Lyceum Theater. So I went to some shows at the old Lyceum Theater. Well, next to it was Horton Grand, and on the ground floor was the Palace Bar. And Bob Johnson had had that Palace Bar forever. The upper 2 floors were abandoned. And so I kind of got more interested in Kit Goldman, and I got more interested in the Horton Grand, and I got more interested in the Lyceum Theater. Well, then I'm having lunch with, they were architects. His name was Al Macy, and the other guy was named Henderson, and I can't recall his first name. But we're having lunch. He's telling me all about it. He said, hey, you ought to somebody ought to dismantle and move that. And I'll never forget, I said, that is the craziest idea I've ever heard. Well, I started to think about it. Well, the more I thought about it, the more interesting it seemed to be to me. So I went to the redevelopment agency, and I said, I've got this crazy idea. Well, I mean, the shopping center was stopped. I mean, the people were fighting, the historic people. These were declared under register, and they didn't want to take them down, and it was holding up the thing. Well, I went to be at the redevelopment agency. Pete Wilson was mayor then. I went to be with his executive staff, and I said, look, I'm interested in this if it can be done. Well, they were very anxious to help me make it happen. And then I met Wayne Donaldson, who was an architect here in the Gaslamp Quarter. There was no financing, and he was about ready to leave. But then anyway, I said, can we dismantle it? Well, fortunately, the outside was brick. Then you got inside the brick, it was all wood. And he said, I think we can do it. So I went to the city, and they then gave us, if you look in front of the hotel, it's only half a street. They closed the street and gave us that half. On the corner where the Horton Grand set was a used tire lot. And next to it on this side was a brothel, abandoned brothel. And where the tires were is where Ida Bailey, and she was a prostitute who ran a fairly interesting place from what I read about. So those were the 2 challenges to build this. So I said, well, I think we can do it. Well, the head of the redevelopment agency then was a man named Dean Dunphy, remember his name. And Dean said, called me up and he said, look, the YMCA wants to expand over here. They've got this salary hotel. You want to try and take down 2? Well, I thought, well, in for a nickel, in for a dollar. So I said, well, that allowed me to ask for some more concessions. And I did ask for some more concessions. And then we figured out what we could do. Well, in those days, and this was 1979 or 80, the federal government said, if you rehab a historic building, you get a 25% tax credit. If you rehab a building over 40 years old, but it's not considered historic, you can get a 20% tax credit. So I said, well, what are the rules? The rules said if you maintain 3 walls, when you rehab something, if you leave 3 walls in place, it's a historic building. Well, I thought, gee, I don't know if we'll get away with this, but we tried. And at that time, this wasn't in the Gaslamp Quarter. Now, I don't know if it's become that. This is, it's adjacent to the Gaslamp Quarter, and I'm not sure whether they, in the last 25 years since I've been involved, whether they got that done. But we are 32 years into when we reconstructed it. So 8 years from now, it could qualify to be on the historic register. Well, so with all these politicians behind me and wanting me to do this crazy project, we tried, and we got the historical people out. We even got people in Washington out here. They debated it, and since we took it down, they wouldn't let us put on the historic register. But we could qualify for 20% tax credits. So they wanted to build it. So in 1981, and I just saw the picture on the wall, we began to dismantle it. And across the street was an old warehouse owned by a Chinese gentleman, and we stored the hotel parts there. The bricks we stored elsewhere. We had hundreds of thousands of bricks because we took down both hotels. And so we had all the bricks here and we had all the parts across there. Now we took all the front of this hotel off. That's original. And then we took molds of what was inside the room. But we had one real issue when we got it down. The first floor was 18 feet high. And the numbers wouldn't work on a 3-story building. So in all honesty, no one, even the city officials didn't ask us this, but we jacked it up to 22 feet so we could add a 3rd floor, so now it's a 4-story building. So we went to rebuild it, then we had a 4-story building, we had 110 rooms, the numbers would pencil on 110 rooms. Well, so then Kit and I began to see each other. She had a 10-year-old son. I had this job here, and I found her a space to build her first theater, a 96-seat theater, she reminded me. Yesterday it wasn't 100, and it was about a half a block away. So I had another crazy idea. I said, we ought to move down here to really experience it. So we decided to move in the Grand Pacific Hotel. Well, the bathrooms were down the hall, and I was in one room, and Kit and her son was in the other. It was pretty rough. I think I could handle everything. It was just waking up in the morning with about 1,000 cockroaches. Now, cockroaches, I found out, don't bite. But it's very unnerving to sleep with them and live with them. And so after 3 or 4 months, we bought a house up in Golden Hill, the 1918 Craftsman House, and we moved up there. And then the woman who owned the Grand Pacific said she'd like to retire, so I got a few partners together, and we bought that, and I moved my office into it. Well, and I had some space for rent, and into my office walked a woman named Billy. Billy Riley is probably one of the most amazing women I ever met. She was the first woman in this town, everything in the hotel business. Out on Shelter Island, the Konakai. She had the first hotel out there, and she ran it, and she walked in, had this nice southern accent, and she was looking for space because she wanted to open an antique store. So I rented her some space, and we started talking, and I found out who she was and what she did. Well, I got her involved and interested with me in the hotel. Then the Historic Society came to me and said, wait a minute, you're going to tear down the Horton Grand Hotel? What happens to the Lyceum Theater? Good point. I'm not going to start taking it down until I can make a deal with them. So I went in and they said, no way, we're not going to do anything. And I said, well, why don't you put it under Horton Plaza over here? You got space in there. No way. Well, then I did the second stupidest thing I've ever done. I went to press and told them that they said no. I really caught a lot of flack for that from them, but I went to the San Diego Repertory Theater. I went to their board and I said, hey, look, why don't you guys do this deal? Well, we negotiated, and they did put the Lyceum Theater down below Horton, and so they tore it down, and so kind of cleared my conscience because I really kind of felt bad about the fact that you take one down, then the other one is vulnerable. So then I talked to Billy, and I said, Billy, we're going to do this project. We got Wayne Donaldson, who I mentioned, to be the contractor. We got M.H. Golden to be the construction people. But we still had an issue, and that was this empty brothel over here. Well, it was interesting because it had 9 front doors and 9 back doors. And so I went to see what was then called, in English, the Chinese Mafia. And I walked in, and I'm not young anymore, but these guys were a bunch of 8 old dudes. I mean, old. Some of them could barely walk. And so I'm trying to find a way to make a deal with them. Well, they were willing, but then I had the historical issue. And the way I sold it to the Historical Society, I said, look, you got 9 doors. Obviously, the guy came in the front door and went out the back door. And there's 9 toilets. There ought to be some interesting things under those 9 toilets. They bought that. So they did, and they found all kinds of really fine coins that had fallen in the toilets when the men went out the back door, and the lady working there must have dropped something in the toilet. So we made the deal, but the deal was that we had to take the lobby of this saddlery and make it into a Chinese museum, which we did. Now, since they opened the museum over here, they've moved that out of there. So what happened then is we had the 2 hotels. We designed it to put this building in the middle, which we did. And then we found out, so then we began, we set up construction, But we left it there because we weren't going to build it until they built the convention center. Well, that got delayed, and those of you who have been in town know that Roger Hescott got in trouble in the early 80s, and they kicked him out of office, and a woman named O'Connor, who had been a kindergarten teacher, nothing against that, but she got elected mayor, and she decided to rebuild the convention center, which delayed it, and I'm under construction, and oh boy, because I'm surrounded by a bunch of hotels who are waiting for it to open. They rebid it, and the price went up $40 million, and it got delayed a few years. So anyway, so then we came to the point where now we have it down, and we have it across the street. And so we decided to build a mock-up of a hotel room in the warehouse. Well, we used it to raise a little money. We needed to raise a little more money to build the hotel, which we did. And it was stored there for years. And then I convinced Billy Riley to take over the job of designing the interior. Well, here we were now with 110 rooms. And we didn't have anything to furnish it. And so she took that over and shopped the country and got all kinds of things. Wayne Donaldson, if you've ever been in the hotel rooms, there's moldings. Well, it doesn't look like a molding, but it's a ceiling that they had put up there that they remolded and put in. And we bought all this old furniture from everywhere. And then we broke ground. And the other story, I'll tell it. Well, then, I'll hold on that. But what happened then is it was called the Heath Davis House. And as we were building this, it was the oldest remaining building in San Diego. And so we negotiated a deal with whatever was on the corner, I don't recall, to put it there. I was shocked when I walked over today, and now it's the Heath-Horton House. But Catalina told me the reason it's the Heath-Horton House is because they found out that that was the only place he ever lived that was still standing. Because if you know a lot of the story. So anyway, I'm sitting down with Billy Riley, one of the most brilliant marketing people too, and we're talking about strategy, and we decided we were going to open in 1986. And I said, well, Billy, you know, the hotel really was built and opened in 1887. She said, nobody's still alive. And she said, and just think what we could do if we could say this is 100 years old when we open. It's a good idea, and we never got busted for it. We probably will now. I've just disclosed this. So what happened then is we decided to begin instructions, and before I start there, I look at my list to make sure I didn't leave anything off that I wanted to talk about. No, I think we're right here. So anyway, on the fight we had to get historic registration and get the 25% tax credits, we lost. Well, then it was a matter of getting financing. And there was a councilman in this district, Lucy Clay was her name, and we went all the way to the state of California to get a special bond issued for us so we could get some cheap financing. And then we had the second trust deed, and then we closed the street, and the city gave us subsidies so that we could build the hotel. And then we broke ground in late 1985. And I haven't been upstairs for over 20 years. It would be interesting to go up there because I'll never forget, we were under construction and we were praying it wasn't going to rain. Praying it wasn't going to rain because we didn't have the roof on and it began to rain. And it rained for 3 weeks, never enough time to dry out. Well, it kind of added to the flavor because all the floors squeaked. And once we put the roof on, and they still did, which made it seem like a very old building. Well, so then what happened, we did name the original restaurant Ida Bailey, after Ida Bailey, because that's exactly where her brother was. We put the Chinese Regal, we put the Chinese Museum out here. And so then we began this construction, we got the rain, the floor squeaked. But then what happened was, next to us, exactly where the Horton Grand Theater is now, was a building. Well, Kit got interested in the possibility of going from 96 seats to a 250-seat theater. So we applied the same principle. We tore it down, saved the bricks. We already knew we wouldn't get historical registration. So we built that, and we began construction on that. And so we opened the Horton Grand in May of 1986. We opened the theater on December 31st, had to get there for the tax credits, 1986. And ironically, the new Lyceum Theater opened in 1986. So All three of them opened on that same day. So then we had someone in the lobby dressed up as Ida Bailey, and all the people who worked here were in costume. And then, irony of irony, we had some job applications for the general manager. And in walks this guy named Bob Earp. And I interviewed him and I said, I know this is a dumb question, but you wouldn't be related to Wyatt Earp, would you? He said, yeah, he's my great-grandfather. I said, you're kidding me. He literally brought in his birth certificate and a book. But so we had Bob Earp as the general manager. And you may have read it, Wyatt Earp lived in the Grand Salary. We had the Chinese Museum on the ground floor. And then on that same ground floor of the old building was Bob Johnson's Palace Bar. And he had pictures of Jack Dempsey and all the people who came in that era all over. And so we named it the Palace Bar. And we got him to take pictures that he had. We named it the Palace Bar. He put all his old pictures in there. So originally it was a Palace Bar. The restaurant was Ida Bailey's. Well, then came along the realization that we were going to have 110 rooms. They were all small rooms. So we decided next to the theater was a building called the Chinese Regal. It had also been a brothel. I guess this was pretty popular for that kind of undertaking at that time. This was south of Broadway then. And so, but it didn't have bricks. It was wood construction, so there was no way to get any tax credits. So if you happen to go out here and look over here, you'll see what we did then is we replicated those buildings. We made those into suites. So with 24 suites and 110 rooms, we now had a manageable sized property to operate. And so all three of those entities opened in 1986. Billy was involved, I was involved. I was still in the Grand Pacific, not living there, but we owned it. My office was over there. Then I moved, when the theater opened, I moved my office to the upper floor. And then Kit had the 196-seat theater and the 250-seat theater. It was named after Alonzo Horton. I'm sorry.
Ernie Hahn.
Ernie Hahn, who in his day in the 80s was the Alonzo Horton because he was redoing downtown. And at that time it was called that. And so that was the hotel. We opened the hotel really 99 years after it was built, but we said 100, got away with all that. We also got away with the building being 4.5 feet taller, so we had extra rooms. The stairway, and I read this, but I wanted to clarify it. Now we had a real problem because this beautiful stairway was 2 stories and we had a 3-story building. So we went around trying to find someone who could do that craftsman, and they didn't exist. They just didn't exist. Well, I read on the page that we took the stairway to Italy. Well, it was the other way around. The Italians came here, and they literally replicated that so it could be a 3-story building. So 1986 in the Gaslamp Quarter, not the place it is today. But that is what happened. That's what we did. We opened the Chinese Regal, I believe, opened in 1987. So 8 years from now, this will be on the historic register. I think it is not amusing, but it tells you a lot about life. Here we are, 32 years after it opened. It's still the Horton Grand Hotel, and they're redefining Horton Plaza. And I was joking with Kit and I. She had a son, and we have a son together. She's here with her guy 20 years later, and I'm here with my wife, Nancy. We're all friends. Our 2 sons have 4 grandchildren, and that's another story. And so I was saying the other day, I'm looking at the calendar, and our grandchildren are 2, 4, 5, 9, and I thought, there's a good possibility they could be at the 200th anniversary of this hotel. That gave me hope, because I think if we can get through the next 8 years without someone getting crazy and saying it's not historic, it will probably be here for another 132 years. That's my story. If you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Yes, sir.
What is redlining, and do they still do that today?
They do, by the way, they still do in certain parts of the world, in certain parts of the country.
How about in the city here?
Not in downtown San Diego, to my knowledge. I mean, what happened was we ran the hotel for 9 years, and then it was obtained by the Rose family. They'd done a beautiful job of keeping it together. And I didn't have any more involvement after 17 years down here where it was my life. I don't know. I'm now in the chocolate business. My son is with me in the business. He lives in Peru, and I travel most of the time, and so I don't know. I don't spend much time in San Diego.
Because I remember I was here in 1978.
Oh,
When it was a nice place. But my question is, what I remember is they were hell bent on tearing this down.
oh, they were.
So
Oh.
I'm kind of curious. What was it because of urban? That was going on?
What you mean? Why do they want to tear it down?
Yeah. Why would we?
Well, yeah, well, it was urban renewal, and
We
originally.
just wanted to flush it.
And,
Within the footprint of Horton Plaza.
Oh, okay.
oh, you mean the Horton Grand?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't explain that well. It was about a 20-acre area that they were going to build Horton Plaza, and they'd torn everything down. And when I met Kit, I looked over there, and here's the Horton Grand and the Lyceum standing in the middle of 20 acres of dirt. Didn't even have a sidewalk. You had to walk across the dirt to go over there from 4th Avenue, about 150 feet over. And I looked at it and thought, who are these crazy people? Me being the crazy guy that moved it. And as I say, I met Kit. She was doing shows there. And I got a chance to see what a beautiful building it was. And then I read about Alonzo Horton. And then it became one of those ideas, don't have them more, that you only want to have once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
He says, as he does, found the world's rarest chocolate in a canyon in northern Peru, and that's what we do now. I guess that's a little crazy too. And my sons are our business partners. Our sons are. Anyway, so they wanted to tear it down, and there was big power to want to do that. And the thing I'm very proud of doing this, but I think the thing I was most proud of myself for is it was one thing to be, a guy working for the Gaslamp for a year, but to have a business card that said finance officer, and I'm representing 16 blocks. Hey, that's a big deal. And so when,
Thank you very much.
oh, well, I didn't mean that, but I mean, so what happened when I went in there, I went in and I'm talking to some 20-something guy. When I said, oh, so you're redlining? He said, just a minute. Out comes the VP, takes me to his office, and he's trying to give me this stern look. And I said, look, face facts, you are. This would make a good story. Oh, wait. And of course, people wanted to rehab their buildings. There's just no financing. And so the thing I remember too is when I went in for this interview, Al Macy was there. And I said, well, look, he said, with this resume, what are you doing applying for this job? And I said, well, after a year, I want to start my own company. And he said, oh, so you're going to set up all these deals with financing and then you're going to go run them. I said, something like that, yeah. And he said, well, so what's good for General Motors is good for you. I said, well, yeah. You don't have any money. You can't redo this thing. You've been in existing for 5 or 6 years. And they said, okay. Al and I became very good friends that deal with it. Excuse me, I'm talking too much. Yes?
Who's the owner of the hotel, and how is the hotel doing?
Well, by the way, we operated it from 86 to 95. Then the Rose family acquired it. I will tell you, have been in this hotel once in 23 years. So the answer is, I looked on, by the way, I went on the internet and they got 5-star ratings for the rooms. I guess they're doing well, which I left out one story about the ghost. When we first built room 309, Kit and I went up, we'd heard about the story, we heard about the rumors, and we had some people say, hey, there's spooky stuff going on in there. So I said, what do you think, Kid? You want to try it out? She said, yeah. Well, we went in there, and for 4 or 5 hours, nothing happened. Then it got really kind of weird in there. And we thought the lights kept going off and on, and I went down and said, are you guys playing with the lights up there? No. Well, then the smartest thing we did from a marketing standpoint is there was I don't remember her name now, but she was a psychic. She was a psychic. And she said, I've heard about the hotel. I'm going to go stay there. Well, not only did she stay there, she got spooked to death, wrote this big article, filled the hotel for months, which is what we tried to do. The other story, I'm talking too much, but you got me going. The other story I remember is the guy promoting it. When we opened the hotel, always, and I'll never forget that, ever. He lined it up, he's going to invite some people who are 100 years old to come over to celebrate the 100-year opening. So he did, and they were about 12 guys, all men, and I'm sitting next door, sitting one next to him, and I said, well, what's the secret of longevity? He said, take care of your feet. If you don't walk, you don't live. I'm walking every day. Anyway, I'm sorry. Any more questions that I can answer? Yes, sir. Over here first.
Tell me a little more about. That sounds like it was a little more trouble than what you told us.
Well, you know what it was, really was. Well, we were in a good negotiating position. Okay. And we thought that if we could narrow the street and make it one way, it wouldn't make so much noise going by this old hotel. And plus, they didn't have to come up with any money to do that. They just had to close half the street. So it did make it one way, and it did make it quieter. And that was the reason behind it. But, you know, of course, I can tell you, honestly, when I walked in, they all thought I was crazy, but if somebody was dumb enough to try it, they'd go along with me. Of course, I was not the world's worst negotiator, but I'd go in and say, I'd like this. Then I'd go back and say, hey, we got an issue. Now I want this. Well, we got another issue. We want this. And they'd say, well, I said, well, then I won't do it. So we continue to make enough concessions because to reassemble a building brick by brick on the outside and to put up the old facades and to duplicate the stuff that was inside and so on. And to find, it took Billy a year to find all over the country's antiques from that time period. So they were willing to make concessions, but we didn't hesitate to get as many concessions as we could because there were so many unknowns. The problem with the gas lamp, and it was a big problem for everybody, there's no set of plans. So you take out a wall and water starts shooting out, and you have no plans that told you there was a pipe there. So it was challenging in that way.
Did you put the bricks back where they were in the old building, the same brick? Didn't you number the bricks?
No. That was another marketing story that
Now you tell me!
Well, you got 200,000 bricks. I mean, and plus, remember, we were going a story higher, and we had to go buy some old bricks to fill in the spots they created. Excuse me, yes. Yes, sir. Or ma'am.
Two
Sure.
questions, I'm sorry. I just wanted to clarify. When was the building deconstructed, and how long was it in the warehouse?
We took it down in 1981.
1981?
And then we stored it over there across the street. And at that time, there was enough space. And I remember it became kind of the in place. And we started to throw parties all the time. Yeah, and Kit did a fundraiser there, and I think others did too. In fact, I remember Pete Wilson was running for the Senate. He came over and threw a party, a big crowd. And the night we opened, Pete Wilson was here and spent the night. I never forget, because Ronald Reagan was president, and I was having lunch with him the next day, and the front desk when I came and said, my God, Reagan, 4 times last night. And so I was talking to Pete Wilson, and he said, this guy's an old dude. He works all night. I mean, he's calling people. He said, I always get called in the middle of the night. He said, these people think he doesn't work long hours. The guy works all night. He may sleep all afternoon. But he works all night. So Pete was here. And as a historian, I wanted to mention something. We hired someone to take a video in 1986 of all the hotel, the opening with all the people who were speaking, including then Senator Wilson. And I have that. And I just found it about 2 years ago and had it put on a DVD. And I couldn't get through it. Made me weep, but if you get all the way through it, I'll have to try it again.
Just ask that second question. The legend is that Roger Whittaker was shot in the 3rd floor of room 309. Are you saying that there wasn't a 3rd floor until you guys built it here? Is that correct?
That's correct.
So where was he shot? Which one?
Well,
What room?
in all honesty, it would have been he was never in room 309.
There was never a room 309?
There was never a room 309. There was never a room by that number.
Was he shot there? You don't know.
I'm old, but I wasn't here. Legend, yes. Legend, yes. I never really heard that.
Well,
Yes.
I can tell you what Billy Riley told me.
Then that's a good source.
She said that y'all bought a lot of this psychic said that Roger came with one of the wardrobes. So his ghost, he was an English pimp, I mean, this is what Billy told me. He was an English pimp, and when this furniture came over, these antiques came over, that he came with the wardrobe.
You know, that could very well be, because the thing in those days, and I don't know if it is now, we had little books you could write in the room. And I went back and read them, and I mean, there were people writing about this guy showed up in the hallway, people had conversations with him. One of them even described what he looked like. Now, I don't know if anybody had a picture that could validate that.
Well, Billy was very skeptical, but she said, I can't dispute the maids talking about the pictures being turned around, the sheets off the bed, and it just keeps happening.
Well, you know, as we heard so many stories, and then what happens after it becomes the thing, you don't know if someone went in there so they had made it up to tell people, but no, people saw him in the hallways. People saw him all over the place, and as I say, we saw light, but we've had people come running out of that room down to the front desk and say, I can't stay there. Made good story. We made sure we got that told. Anyway, yes, sir.
Who is Horton?
You know, I can tell you now, many people know about him, but I can repeat the story that many people know. Alonzo Horton came from the Midwest. In fact, he was from Wisconsin. He started a town called Hortonville. Had about 13,000 people. He was a merchant in San Francisco. When he was 54 years old, I think that was 1860s, he came down here to visit, and there was no town here. The waterfront was just a waterfront. He had to get out of the boat and wade into what is now downtown San Diego because he was going to Old Town to a meeting. He missed the buckboard. He started walking around and he said, hey, wait a minute, this is prime real estate. He bought the whole waterfront. Cheap, bought the whole waterfront. Well, and then he began to bring people in. There were like 2,000 people living over in Old Town. 7 years later, there were 50,000 people here. He made one fatal mistake. He decided to bring the engineers out from Wisconsin. Well, the government said, well, you can build along the railroad, or along the ocean here, but the lease would cost you so much. Well, his engineers said, hey, we can build it inland through the mountain passes for 1/10 the cost. So they did, in the 100-year floodplain. It rained 3 years in a row. The railroad pulled out. We should be lucky that it did, because they pulled out. The population went from 50,000 down to 3,000. Long Beach didn't exist. They built that artificial harbor of Long Beach. If he had gone around the road, we'd be Long Beach. We wouldn't be sitting here. We'd be, if you've been to Long Beach, it's a very industrial area. But that was his fatal mistake. Well, then the thing then Alonzo went broke, lost all his many houses, may have ended up living in that one house. But the story too then is they said, well, okay, Alonzo's broke, but he's kind of the spokesman for the town. So where Horton Plaza Park is, we'll give him that land. And then we'll buy it back from him a little bit each year. Well, he kept living and living and living, and he ran out of that money. But now he's the spokesman for the new downtown, so they keep funding. I think he'll live 89, 90 years old. But that's Alonzo Horton, and that was his story. But he got all this built by all these speculators that said, hey, this is going to be San Diego's natural harbor. It's going to be what is now Long Beach Harbor. Any other questions I can answer for you? I'm trying to think if I had any more stories that I forgot to tell. Let me look quick at my list. Because we only do this every 25 years, and I'm not planning on being here 25 years from now. Okay, Lyceum theory, yes. Bricks, yes. Thank you.
I want to thank Dan for a wonderful talk and telling his fascinating story. Thank you all for being here tonight. We have a little present for you to take home.
Well, thank you.
History Talks is a monthly lecture series. Our next one is February 7th, and it's going to be kickstarting the redevelopment of the Gaslamp Quarter with Marie Burke-Leah, who's right back there and did research on the historic buildings of the Gaslamp. So make sure you come back for that. You can grab the brochure in the back. It has the list of the next 6 lectures till June. I encourage you all to become members. Part of your membership is this lecture series. And if anyone's interested, Sandy's going to be doing a little tour of the building, learn more about the early history of it.